You're listening to Natural Resources University. In this podcast network, our hosts are university researchers and extension specialists, opening your gateway to the science of natural resource management.
Welcome to Fire University. This is a podcast dedicated to fire ecology and management within the Natural Resource University podcast network. My name is Dr. Marcus Lashley. I'm a wildlife biologist, an assistant professor of disturbance ecology at the University of Florida, and a lifelong hunter that's passionate about wildlife conservation and management. In this podcast, I will interview scientists and professionals not only on the latest research in fire ecology, but also about their experiences, in hopes that you as the listeners can learn why fire ecology is important and also how you can use it to meet your natural resource management goals. So let's get to the burning questions in Fire University. Hey everybody, welcome back to Fire University. I have again with me John Gruchy. We went to graduate school together and worked with Craig Harper, and he's one of those people that thinks about field management quite a bit. And this is something that I think is important for us to cover during this time when we have a lot of turkeys with poults on the ground, and we have a lot of nesting quail, I guess, as well. So, John, I appreciate you coming on the show again. Really good to hear from you and talk to you.
Yeah, man, I appreciate it, Marcus. Good deal. Yeah, I actually did a whistle count this morning for bobwhites. I only heard one bird, a little depressing, but I texted with some other folks in the state, and they had a pretty good morning. Heard a few whistles. So
good. Well, I guess the reason I wanted you to come on here, I know that especially in your graduate studies and a lot of your career, you've done a lot with field management and restoration of prairie and those types of things. And I think it's a good topic and timely topic for us to talk about. What are we looking for in terms of the structure of a plant community in old field to benefit a hen with poults, or for quail use? What are you thinking about? What does that look like?
Sure, that's a good question, and I mean, you can go to the literature. I'd say bobwhite brood rearing and nesting cover has been described very well in the literature. Now, I will say that brood rearing, quantifying a bobwhite brood or actually tracking them is really difficult, right? Because they're little, and we're just now getting the technology to be able to track individual broods and be able to track the actual chicks. Up until now, mostly what we're doing is tracking the hens, this. And so, there is a little bit of discrepancy there. Maybe some people could argue balls and strikes on some different things about exactly what those broods are doing. But in general, and you and I talked about this beforehand, bobwhites are pretty good, pretty strong selectors. And so in most of the studies that we look at, we can really well define pretty much bobwhite nesting and brood rearing cover. And they're two different cover types. So bobwhite brood rearing cover, one of the key factors we're going to look for is bare ground. And if you look at a lot of these studies, they quantify bare ground a little bit differently. But essentially we want openness at ground level. We want small chicks, especially those first 2 weeks. Those little chicks are going to be about as big as your thumbnail, right when they hatch out, and then they're going to piddle around and get maybe as big as your whole thumb, after that first 2 or 3 weeks. And we've got to be able to get those little chicks moving around and be able to forage, because what they really need are invertebrates. And about 80% of their diet that first 2 weeks is going to be bugs, and they're trying to build feathers, and they need protein, all that. And so we got to be able to get them that stuff, and they've got to be able to access invertebrates. Mm-hmm. And I know you've done a lot of research on the bug communities and stuff like that. You and I both have talked extensively about that. There's some interesting things going on there that we could talk about later.
Sure. Well, before we go any further, when you're saying bare ground, I just want to clarify what you mean. You don't mean like it's all open dirt,
Sure.
right? Like if you dished a field, that would be bare ground, but that's not
That's
really what
right.
you're talking about, is it?
No, yeah. So that's actually a good question. If we, it's kind of confusing in the literature because if you read the studies from Kansas and Texas, they probably are talking about dirt. They'll say
Yeah.
a plant community is 20 or 30% bare ground, and of course they get like
Hmm.
14 inches of rain a year, so they probably are. That's probably true. But in Florida, there's no such thing as a plant community with really any bare ground, right? I mean,
Hmm.
if you just add water and you guys have what, like a 360-day growing season, and so you're not going to have just actual bare dirt for very long in most of the
Hmm.
southeast. What we're talking about, I guess, is bare ground at that bottom foot of vegetation there. So if you were to look
Okay.
at a plant community straight down and you're standing up, it's going to be green. But when you just part that initial canopy of vegetation, you're looking at the actual soil, you should be able to see some soil. And so
Hmm.
the opposite of bare ground, if you want to think about what bare ground is, it may be better to think about what it's not. It's not litter. It's not thatch. It's not deep pine straw. It's not deep, thick grass. So
Hmm.
we want to have some bare ground when we're talking about brood rearing. And usually
Okay.
that's going to be a cover type that's 1 to 2 growing seasons following some type of disturbance, fire or
Hmm.
disking.
Okay. So really, if we were thinking about it at the human scale, it would be like walking into a forest and you have a canopy of trees over you,
Sure.
but you don't have much in the understory or midstory that's blocking you from walking around under it.
Yeah, it's like
So we
walking in
still have,
the so-called park-like forest. We're walking in, we
yeah.
could walk easily and move around. Same
Okay.
same principle, I guess, for the bobwhites. We even called it umbrella cover. So if you think about the
Like,
structure of an
hmm.
umbrella, you've got a canopy above and then a
Right.
central stem. So
Yeah. So that's okay. So basically, these little bumblebees, that's what I guess a lot of people will call the little chicks when they're
yeah, yeah,
small
yeah.
like that. They need to be able to walk around under the canopy of vegetation, which itself may only be a foot tall.
That's right. And so not only is it important for them to be able to move around easy to get those bugs, but man, they can't thermoregulate really well at that
Hmm.
size. And so it's particularly, the upper critical temperatures, I mean, especially if you're talking about these second broods, we get into July,
Hmm.
they've got to be able to have shade or they're just going to cook. So
Yeah.
they've got to be able to, and also ventilation, under that
Hmm.
cover type. So not just so most of your vegetation that's going to do that is going to be forbs, broadleaf herbaceous plants. The umbrella kind of
Hmm.
describes the structure of a forb, but then also woody cover is pretty important. So, and when I say woody cover, I'm mainly talking about shrubs, low growing shrubs like briars or sumac
Hmm.
or plum thickets, those kinds of things. They're really good for some kind of vertical structure to be able to hide
Hmm.
those critters from predators.
I got you. So, um, when you're saying forbs in an old field scenario, are there some particular forbs that you're looking for in that community?
Um, it kind of depends on the soil type and kind of where you are. I'm in Mississippi, of course, so where you are in the state is going to be, maybe the dominant forb community. In most of our upper coastal plain, we like, ragweed, common ragweed is very good.
Hmm.
In some of the state, goldenrod, which is a perennial. Most of these are going to be annual plants, but of course, goldenrod is a perennial. It's not bad. Some of it I've seen it dominant in cases. We'll
Hmm.
also see Bidens or beggar ticks, which is an annual. Some different plants that would be common. When we get further south, we'll actually see a lot more. When we get into the lower coastal plain, we get a lot more of the legumes, your sensitive briar, your desmodiums and Lespedezes and all that. Of course, we have those in the upper coastal plain as well. So
Hmm.
but it could be any variety of plants. I'll be honest with you. There's two kinds of things we're talking about here: composition and structure.
Yeah.
And just from when we talk about animal use,
Hmm.
I think there's sometimes when they certainly key in on composition. If you look at white-tailed deer, they're going to key in on those oak motts whenever they're dropping uh, acorns and things like that, right? But
Hmm.
for brood rearing, I'm going to say they're keying in on structure. So I've seen broods in thistle patches. You know what I mean? And you and I were
Hmm.
just talking about nesting cover. We've seen them. As much as we hate non-native grasses, I've seen bobwhites nest in non-native grass. It's been reported in the literature. I mean, it can be done. It's not so much a composition thing for some aspects of the animal's life history. It's more of a structure thing.
Well, I think that's a good point. We both have seen that, and particularly at nesting, the nesting stage for quail, they seem to be able to tolerate some of these less desirable conditions.
Sure.
But one of the anecdotes that we just talked about a few minutes ago before we got on is when they do nest there, it's actually once they've hatched is the big problem, right? They've got to get their chicks somewhere else where they have that structure so they can thermoregulate and find insects and avoid predators and all that.
Yeah.
And that's where the non-native grass in particular becomes a big problem.
It's going to fail, yeah. So, nesting cover, we described brood rearing. Nesting cover is actually quite a bit different, right? So basically nesting cover is going to be senescent grass. You're going to have to either have some type of substrate, right? Either senescent grass or pine needles, clearly in most of our pine forests in the South, they're going to be abundant, and that's a commonly used nesting substrate. I've seen them use leftover forb stems, like if you know how giant ragweed and things like that have the residual stem from the previous year, they'll make nests out of that. They can use a lot of different things, but they're basically going to need, some type of dead plant material to be able to make the nest. So that's their nesting substrate. They also are going to need some type of vertical structure to hide the nest. Most people are familiar with quail nests. They look like a little igloo, and they're going to select areas that kind of cover that opening, where that opening is covered and not open to potentially be predated.
Yeah, that makes sense. So do you want to talk a little contrast, I guess, that to turkeys before we get into how you create these things?
We can. The turkey side of things is a little, you and I kind of talked about it beforehand. I used to pride myself in, thinking I was an upland game bird biologist, and then we started putting GPS collars on turkeys, and they pretty much took me to school. But in any case, what we just talked about, bobwhites, is pretty straightforward. The literature has kind of got bobwhites licked. They're strong selectors, we might say, and so that nesting cover is going to look generally the same. Even I would even say you could go from Florida to Oklahoma to South Texas, and it's going to be pretty similar with nesting and brood rearing for bobwhites. It's going to be totally different. Composition is going to be totally different, but the structure is going to be fairly similar.
Yeah.
Wild turkeys, that's not so, man. They're what we would call, particularly for nesting, they're kind of weak selectors, and so they're going to nest in a variety of substrates. And we've all found the turkey nest in the middle of this senescent wheat field, last year's wheat or whatever. Seen turkeys nest in places where we thought that, what's she thinking? That's not got a chance of making a successful nest. So, and it's not anything, with the wild turkey in general. It's just they tend to be weak selectors. They're probably operating at scales, a little bit broader spatial scales than we're used to working with. But in general, turkey nesting cover is going to be a little more rough than bobwhite nesting cover. So bobwhite nesting cover is going to be that 2 to maybe 3 years after disturbance. Turkey nesting cover is probably going to be more like, depending on your precipitation regime, probably going to be more like 3 or 4 years after disturbance when we start to really see that dense vegetation to hide a turkey nest. You think about it, a turkey's a little bigger animal. It's got a little more to hide, and their nests are not very well constructed. They're kind of out, pretty vulnerable to being seen. So they need a little bit more dense structure. But now that being said, I've totally seen turkeys nest in a fallen treetop in the middle of a broad open forest. So it's a little bit more variable.
Yeah. Well, and I guess one of the points to make about that is the context matters a lot that the turkey is in. And, if they're relatively weak selectors, like you're saying, if they don't have many places to select from that we would view as high quality, they might end up in somewhere that's a little bit lower quality. That doesn't necessarily mean what they selected is high quality, I guess.
That's right. So, if you hate to get to take home messages in the first 5 minutes here, but the take home is diversity, right? The more we can distribute quality nesting cover throughout the landscape, the more likely the weak selector is to plop down in a patch that's going to give them higher success.
Right.
So if you look at nesting is just tough, turkey nesting in the literature, but in general, it's kind of as we've described it. Brood rearing cover is a little more sensitive. In other words, it's going to be more similar to the bobwhite brood rearing cover, and actually you do see some selection. I guess we were just talking about there was a paper in 2020 that kind of looked across a bunch of different GPS collar studies and basically found that hens with broods were selecting open areas or areas with more open cover types. And then it also found that their survival probability decreased with increasing distance moved in the first 3 days. So what that means is that hen, after she hatches, within that first 3 days, if she's got to go a far distance to find what she's looking for, that brood rearing cover where she needs to be able to forage those chicks, and they're going to spend 80% of their day foraging. They're just eating because they got to grow rapidly. If she's got to take them a long distance to find that food resource and to find that cover, it's going to have a lower probability of that brood being successful. So we've got a little bit more to say about brood rearing cover in turkeys. And like you and I talked about, if you really kind of get an eye for it, you start looking across the landscape, it's pretty evident that brood rearing cover is probably, in some cases, probably the limiting factor on some landscapes.
Yeah, especially it seems like in the South where, turkeys, we're worried about their populations.
Sure.
I know that I drive around, across the South all the time, several states, and it's pretty rare that I see a field that I think, man, that's really good brood rearing cover for turkeys.
Where do you end up seeing the broods most of the time? On the road right away. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
They're gonna be in the edge of the road ditch or kind of.
I saw one just the other day and with the brood right on the edge of I-75.
But then you look around and you go, well, where else were they going to rear that brood?
Yeah.
There's not a whole lot of options. So, that's one thing to pay attention to. And again, if they're going to be drawn to open areas, again, they can't roost in trees at that young age. They're not flyers yet. So until they can roost up off the ground, having some field cover or some open areas that are being managed as high quality brood rearing cover is probably going to be beneficial to folks who are interested in having dense turkey and quail populations.
So let's kind of circle back to what you were just talking about with the study. And to preface that, I think the data on turkeys show a similar pattern to what you're talking about and what we've just said. When you look at nesting, it's not as good as we'd want it to be, but if you just kind of look at broadly at nesting success, it's poor to moderate generally across studies.
Sure.
But if you look at brood rearing, that's generally pretty bad.
Yeah.
So it seems like to me that might be linked to what we're describing, where the birds need to get to high quality brooding cover. And then you mentioned that study about moving far.
Yeah.
And that being a really bad thing. So I wanted to kind of preface all the way up to this lead in to ask you, well, does it matter what kind of opening it is? Is it okay for it to be a Bahia pasture or a fescue pasture or whatever, or does it need to be similar to what you were describing earlier for quail?
Yeah. And I think, again, that kind of depends on the landscape we're in, right? So I'll cop out behind that. But, if you're in South Texas, it's going to be a little different than a lot of other places. And I would preface by saying that that first 3 days, or certainly the first 14 days, it probably matters, probably a pretty big deal. And it's going to be more of that umbrella type cover that we're going to seek out. And then in terms of what type of opening, I don't know that necessarily matters. We see them using, and I know in this study, some other things they're looking at roads, daylighted roads. Some of this is on big tracts of public land where they basically would classify it as a closed road, so a low traffic road. They'll use those. They also use pretty commonly, we'll use food plots, supplemental plantings, the edges and all, and most of those are going to be fallowed through the summer. So I think it depends on the landscape context, let's say, as to what opening because I don't
Mm-hmm.
imagine turkeys are going to be utilizing those big soybean fields, where bobwhites will use the edge of a soybean field and even get 100 yards, 200 yards out into the soybean field with a brood.
Mm-hmm.
I don't see that happening quite as much with wild turkey. They're going to be more hugging the edges of those of the forests and things like that. But
Mm-hmm.
in any case, I think it just you it depends heavily, but you could broadly say that they're going to be selecting uh, managed openings. It's going to have some type of frequent disturbance, like a
Mm-hmm.
roadside, like a food plot. Everything that we've
Yeah.
talked about is going to be similar in that it's a disturbed cover type.
So it sounds like to me there are lots of ways that you could get to having the opening, but
Sure.
you're still, especially for that first 2 weeks, you need that structure that you were talking about with the umbrella structure, so that the little tiny poults can run around under the canopy
Sure.
of cover.
Yeah, I think so, man. And like I said, what we mainly wanted to talk about today was probably just managing fallow fields. I think what we
Mm-hmm.
see in my day job, I'm a private lands biologist, and so I go out and look at individual landowner properties and make recommendations, that kind of thing. And it's pretty uncommon to see a field that's managed for brood rearing cover. In general, if you're on a property in the south and they have an opening, they're probably going to plant it. They're probably going to do some other type of management than
Mm-hmm.
just managing for the purpose of nesting and brood rearing cover, unless of course they're high intensity bobwhite plantations and all that would fall
Sure.
maybe outside of that. But for the most part, you're talking about working forest or working agricultural lands, and so
Yeah.
it's hard
So
to
so
find those
people are
fallow fields.
Yeah, so people are planting crops in it, or they have it planted in a grass that they're
That's right.
haying or
That's right.
grazing or something, or they're planting it in food plots if they're wildlife interests.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
you're saying that you don't see this these old field
Yeah.
communities being managed very often for wildlife.
Yeah, we've started calling them just unplanted openings. If you've got an
Yeah,
opening in the forest, it's not planted. What are we going
right.
to do with that, and how are we going to manage it?
And just to be specific about unplanted, you mean it's not planted in a food plot
That's
or
right.
in a pasture grass?
An agronomic crop. It's not
Yeah.
planted in any type of crop. Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So would you say, it sounds like you're telling me then, in your experience, that's often the problem, is that it has some sort of grass in it, or a crop in it, or what are you, when you see fields and you're thinking about trying to get them into a usable community for structure for brood rearing,
Sure.
what's normally the problem, I guess is what I'm asking.
Yeah, yeah. So again, it just comes down to the fact a lot of it is very landowner objectives, but for the most part, if you ride around most of the southeast, if it is a forest landowner, they're probably going to be trying to make financial decisions in a lot of the forests. They're going to be managing
Mm-hmm.
for pulpwood or saw timber and pines, or they've got hardwoods and they maybe have an aesthetic issue. So every time they have any opportunity for an opening, the first thing they do is try to plant either some type of food plot, or again, like I said, if we're on a different type of property where they've got an agronomic or an agricultural objective. So I would say one of the biggest, and regardless, by the way, those turkeys are still going to find those openings, and they're going to try to brood rear in some of them or nest in some of those openings that maybe aren't in the best
Mm-hmm.
cover types for those types of activities. So I would say for sure, having some managed openings that are managed for brood rearing and nesting would be a huge thing. And then, of course, if we would love to be able to have nesting and brood rearing cover within the forest, within the context of that managed forest.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's another noble goal. And then also having corridors that kind of connect all that stuff. So having the managed roadways and all that kind of stuff, having linear
Mm-hmm.
openings and taking advantage of right of ways, power line right of ways, gas line right of ways. We'll see a lot of nesting and on those right of ways.
Okay. So could you walk us through, if you've got this unplanted opening
Sure.
that you're talking about, what's going through your head when you're thinking about managing that? in the long term, I guess, to keep it in a structure that is maximizing the
Yeah.
production of poults or chicks?
So mostly what we're doing is, if I go out onto an individual property, one of the first things I want to look at is the soil map. I want to see what kind of soils we're dealing with on that property,
Mm-hmm.
and then I want to think about what's their current land use. So if it's mostly forest and we don't have any openings, I want to start creating openings. That's going to take timber harvest, and so it's a little different situation than some of the other things we talked about. But basically, I want to target brood rearing and nesting cover in areas that have the worst soil. And that's because if I want to put my agronomic crops in my best soil, right? If I'm going to have a clover patch or a food plot for deer, I want to put that in the best soil, and I want the dry ridges and the deep sands and all that. That's where I'm going to put brood rearing and nesting cover, because it's also easier to maintain. I'm not trying to constantly fight sweet gum and those types of things, the aggressive plants coming in. So the first thing you want to do is look at the soil map and figure out, do I want to make an opening, or do I have an existing opening that I want to change the strategy on? Sometimes we've got landowners who are trying to force food plots into junk dirt. We'll say, man, that's a better use for that, is to try to go into nesting and brood rearing. So that's one instance. The other instance is if we're working on maybe a little more of a working landscape where they've got cattle, or you've got hay, you've got soybeans, row crop, that kind of thing. And so then you're looking at a little bit different strategy. What are some odds and ends? Maybe what's their overall goal? If it's still to have cattle, maybe we need to look into how we can balance some of that. But if we've got some odds and ends, some places we can make brood rearing cover, one of the first things we're going to have to do is eliminate the pasture grasses from those fields. And they're almost always in the South. Almost any field at some point has been planted a common Bermuda grass or Bahia grass or tall fescue, depending on your kind of latitude. So the first thing we want to do is identify that composition issue, that we might have, and we want to try to eliminate it. So those pasture grasses, you and I were just kind of joking back and forth at how we've seen turkey nests in those fields. That was probably more of a function of what they had to deal with, right? They didn't have many other options, but we know for a fact those pasture grass fields are not good brood rearing cover. In fact, we've got studies, they've done the thermal studies, and I mean they put the little copper quail out, and then they've also foraged chicks. And I mean, it takes them seriously like 30 minutes on a hot day in the summer to expire in a Bermuda grass field. That's a fact. I mean, that's all been done. So, we want to try to eliminate that if we can on recreational properties, if we can entirely on recreational properties. But if we've got to have some patches here and there for hay crops, or if it's, a pasture situation, we want to try to find odds and ends where we can eliminate pasture grass and then manage the native seed bank. And so we do that with a combination of fire, burning, maybe herbicides. We're going to have to eliminate those pasture grasses first off with herbicide.
And it's often going to take more than just you go out and spray some Roundup over it, right? And it's normally
it's
a little more intense even. So
it depends. Almost any of the pasture grasses that we've listed are going to take multiple treatments. And so you're going to have to prepare that pasture grass for spraying, and you're usually going to do that with, either haying or burning, or something to clean off the thatch and kind of get it green and growing. And then you're going to do your initial herbicide application. You and I were just talking about Bahia grass before we got on here. Bahia is one of those weird ones that's it's easy to kill when it's easy to kill. Whenever the stuff is green and growing, you've got to make sure it's actively growing. It's got a little tiny blade. If it gets any drought at all, it'll curl up and it won't take up chemical. So you make sure your grass is cleaned off pretty. It's got to look like it's ready to be hayed, Just the cattle farmer's mouth ought to be watering when he looks at that field. And then we want to go in there and spray the heck out of it. And your initial treatment is probably going to be a broad spectrum herbicide, something like Roundup or Imazapyr. You're going in to try to knock it in the head as good as you can, and then hopefully you're going to follow up maybe within the same growing season. Sometimes it'll be a growing season later and have to do some type of follow-up application. But you usually have to triage that, right? So after I spray Bermuda grass, it's going to be probably Johnson grass or something like that coming back, and I have to do a different chemical. So it just all depends, man.
Okay, and then even after that, you may have patches of it or other things trying to invade that you would go back in and spot spray
Yeah,
or,
yeah,
or
it's a
something,
never-ending
right?
cycle, man. I would say on
Yeah.
average, it's going to take at least 2 to 3 years to get a field kind of right, if you will,
Mm-hmm.
after you start the process of trying to kill pasture grass. So don't think it's a one and done type process. It is a commitment. And
Right.
even after that 2 to 3 years, you're gonna have recurring Bermuda grass in the fire ant hills and on the roadsides. The any roads you've got going in and out there, and then of course you're gonna have invasive plants like Kogan grass and those types of things that may come in. So you're always gonna have to monitor
Mm-hmm.
um, that vegetation type.
Yeah. So it sounds like learning a few key plants is probably important, especially the ones that you don't want around.
Yeah, yeah. You need to learn a few plants, or it's kind of like I talk about having a boat or a bird dog or anything. I don't want to have a boat or a bird dog, but I want to have a buddy who has a boat or a bird dog, right?
Yeah.
And so you need to learn some plants, or you need to make a friend who knows plants. And you just
Yeah.
take pictures of them and send it to the friend, right?
Yeah. Yep. So that's why I invited you on here, John.
Yeah. Now, yeah.
Yeah.
Remember that? Yeah. Now somebody heard that and they're like, "Oh, that turkey. He's that's when he wants to go fishing. That's why he's calling me up. What you doing?"
No, I meant for plant identification. I didn't even think
Okay.
about
Now
fishing.
you're not going to
I've
take
been
me
fishing
fishing.
with you, John. I'm not trying to go back. I'm kidding. I'm
Oh
kidding.
no.
I don't even think we've been fishing together. We should.
Yeah. Yeah. We'll have to do
Uh,
that one day.
um, so okay, let's assume we've gotten rid of grass.
Yeah.
Then
Yeah.
what?
So the next, I guess the next step, again, you got to kind of diagnose everything, but in general, you got to look at what does your landscape look like and what's my limiting factor? What am I trying to manage for? So if you're trying to manage for brood rearing cover, generally you're going to disturb that pretty frequently with either fire or disking. Disking works pretty well for brood rearing cover, and we tend to do that in the fall. Mainly because
Mm-hmm.
if you disc in the spring, you tend to get a less favorable plant response. It's going to be more of
Mm-hmm.
those annual grasses, things like crabgrass and Johnson grass. For anybody that's done moist soil management, we actually want a disc in the spring and summer because we want those grasses, right? We're trying to make grass for waterfowl food, but for
Mm-hmm.
bobwhites and for turkeys, we're trying to make more broadleaf plants, and so we tend to do soil disturbance in the fall.
Okay.
Now, if you're talking about nesting cover, you're probably going to let it succeed a little bit longer, or you're probably going to look at breaking up fields or breaking up complexes of fields and doing different treatments at different times of year and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So in that case, you might have part of the field that's a little bit older that you're
That's right.
leaving that way for nesting, whereas it'll be directly adjacent to the more recently disturbed area that would provide better brooding.
Sure,
So,
sure. You got to just get your crayons out and kind of look at your property and lay it out how you want to break those fields up, or how do you
mm-hmm.
want to look at field complexes. Maybe you can have, if you've got several fields that are close to one another that are already kind of broken up naturally, maybe you can incorporate those, or you can incorporate them into your existing forest management. We do that a lot on big tracts of public land. We're going to burn a stand, we'll take in the field, and burn in, trying to burn it at different rotations. But in general, what we're trying to do is maintain, what I'm sure your listeners are familiar with, what we would call early successional cover. And so
Mm-hmm.
those are going to be those early cereal stage plant communities that are usually going to be 2 to 3 years post disturbance. Now, for wild turkeys, you probably are looking at a little bit longer for nesting cover, for good nesting cover. But that also,
Mm-hmm.
keep in mind that none of this is happening in a vacuum. You may have nesting cover in the forest somewhere nearby.
Right. That's the idea, is to have some of each.
That's
And
right.
what we
That's
were kind of alluding to, and maybe not saying directly, is the thing that you and I both, I think, agree is most often missing is that high quality brooding cover.
That's right. That's right. So, yeah, and you can, like I said, we can get at that by a couple of different methods. And usually what we see when we have properties that are using fire a lot, and if they are doing the field management for brood rearing and they're using a lot of
Mm-hmm.
fire, they're mostly going to do that in the dormant season.
Yeah.
It's a common thing. Not trying to talk bad about anybody for doing dormant season burning, but that tends to be the most common fire regime. So what we see as kind of a negative consequence of that is that tends to grass fields in or forests or whatever. If you're repeatedly burning on, let's say, a 2 to 3 year rotation and you're burning in February and March, it's going to be sage grass pretty quick. And so when that happens, go ahead.
Before you go on, when you're talking about grass now, you're talking about like native warm season grasses,
native
not
grass.
the same as the pasture grasses. So
That's right. That's right. It's those
they're
fields
clump forming grasses, but you start to get, they're a good thing, I guess, to have incorporated, but not dominating. Is that what you're saying?
That's right. That's right. It won't take very long at all, really, for even the warm season grasses to become dominant. And it just depends again on the soil type and where you are in the country. So,
I didn't want to cut you off, but maybe this can lead you back into where I think you were going. So, can you, if burning during that time it causes that issue, what I'm gathering from that, I think you were going, is that by changing the timing of fire or changing what the disturbance is, can change that problem?
Yeah, definitely. So that's you're right. That's kind of where I was going. Essentially, if you've got a field that's starting to grass in, that's generally when we're going to go to the disking, right? Disking is usually a good tool for making brood cover, but when you start to have a field or even a forested area that's open enough and it starts to grass in, that's when we really start to look for soil disturbance. And I know you're the herbivory guy and fire ecology, fire and herbivory interactions and all. I'm sure there's some natural processes that tie in to all of that. But I mean, once we grass in a field, we've got to pretty much do some type of soil disturbance to try to break up that clump forming grass and be able to stimulate some of those annual plants to come back in. So I don't know.
Interesting. So when you're saying soil disturbance, you're talking about just disking?
In most of the South, the deep South especially, we don't have the option to run livestock into an area in most cases. It's either livestock or it's recreation. And so for the most part, we're kind of left with disking. And when we talk about disking, there's a couple of different, that not all discs are created equal, not all, not all activities like that. We've joked before, when you get a dense patch of grass, broom sedge field that's just socked in and you got a little small disc, it's like dragging a dead chicken across it. It's not going to break it up. So sometimes you got to have what we would call a new ground disc, where I come from, or an offset disc, a cutting disc, if you will. There's a bunch of different names for them, but basically a big heavy disc, an aggressive disc to break up grass where it's gotten to be really rank and dense. Then if you got sandy soil, some people do that we're listening to, you can get away with a less aggressive disc, more of what we would call a farm disc or your standard hunting club food plot disc. You know what I mean? There's a bunch of different vendors, and I think it's very difficult to describe. As soon as I think I've described it, found a way to describe equipment, then I learned that I haven't done it very well. But in any case, once you have that, decided how heavy an implement you're going to need, or you've acquired one, let's say, then you got to worry about how intensively we're running that disc over there. So, you can't just do down and back. Sometimes what we would call a pass. If it's a heavy soil, sometimes it might take 2 or 3 passes down and back, or even 4 passes to break that grass up really well. But if you're in some of that sandy coastal plain soil, you might can get away with 1 pass, down and back, break the grass up and do a good job. It just depends on your soil type.
Okay. So what about the fire timing?
Yeah, we hadn't talked about that much. So we do, of course, I went straight to disking, but we've tried a bunch of different things to decrease grass density with fire timing. And I don't know that we've got necessarily a definitive answer. As soon as I say something, there are other fire people who are going to send you hate mail, and that's okay because it's you. I'm good with it. But essentially,
you're okay with them giving it to me?
Yeah, that's fine as long as they send it to you. But I have not been able personally, nor have I seen a lot in the literature where we can do once we have a field that's already, or a plant community that's already rank with grass, we go in and implement summer fire or late summer fire, any timing of fire that would decrease grass density. I have not really seen that. Now, I personally was involved. We had a couple of summers where we had just red flag conditions, bad droughts.
Mm-hmm.
And we burned some areas that were socked in with grass fields now, not forest. We weren't killing trees and whatnot. Burned them in July, the heat of July. And I
Mm-hmm.
mean, you walk out in the field and it just crunches under your feet. Crunch, crunch, crunch. It's just terribly dry. And when we got done burning, I thought, I need to go to church. We've committed a sin here. This is bad. I've killed everything in this field. And you come back the next growing season and it really does look like you've decreased grass presence, grass's density. But when you really look at it, what we did was decrease reproductive tillering. We just kind of made the bunches smaller. And the next season, you get a little rain, and boom, it's right back to being just as thick as it was. So we didn't actually kill the grass or reduce the plant population, if you will, of the grass. Maybe just make it a little stunted. So I've kind of moved towards disking to decrease grass. But where fire timing does make a big difference is when we start to get woody vegetation coming into those fields. And I do feel like we can do a little bit, certainly in fields where we don't have the overstory trees to worry about, we can do a lot with fire timing and woody vegetation control. So you can.
So how would you change it to be better with that?
And without question, I would try to go in the late growing season, and I would try to get a severe fire. If I had a field that was just too dense with woody saplings, let's say we've got sweet gum or red maple or elm, something like that that's coming in at, 500 stems to the acre. I mean, just a dense sapling count. And it was in a field, man, there's no reason not to go in with a late summer, August, September, maybe October fire and try to get a severe fire. You and I, you can talk more about this than I, but basically, I want an intense fire. No, and I shouldn't. I don't just want intense. I want severity. I want it to cause damage. So, we're doing.
Your intent is to kill all the trees.
That's right. So. That's right. We're going to kill the trees, and you can actually in a field. It's just so much less stressful than it is trying to do that in a mature forest. Where you don't want to kill the big trees and you just want to. So that's kind of the happy thing about field management, and the thing that I enjoy the most about it is not having to worry about killing the big trees, because we can get some really severe fires and take those woody things out.
Yeah, that's something we haven't really talked about on here at all, is the role that more severe fire could play. We normally talk about low intensity meandering fires.
No, this one's not a meandering fire. I want to make a scary fire in the fields. And again, during that growing season, I want to get as much crown scorch as I can on that. I'm assuming we're talking about saplings that are, 6 feet tall, 6-7 feet and lower. When they get much bigger than that, it's difficult because they start to make their own shade, and you don't have fuel, and it won't carry, and you won't get crown scorch. Everybody's familiar with that. So, we're talking about letting it roll, man.
Yeah, getting it done.
Yeah.
So, and another thing, you talked about repeatedly burning during the dormant season leading to a grass problem, and the late growing season not fixing that problem necessarily with too much grass.
Yeah.
But burning the fields in the fall or the late growing season, like you're talking about, doesn't lead you to the grass problem either. Is that what I'm...
Not necessarily. There was actually, Kaiser did a study there in Tennessee it was planted native grass, to be fair, so the grass was already there. But it actually, it actually resulted in increased density with the late growing season fire. I think what it comes down to is you got to mix up your pitches, man. If you doing the same thing over and over again, that grass is just if you're just essentially burning the senescent material off the top of the grass over and over and over again, it's just going to keep responding. So, but I have heard people say
rotating disking in might need to be a part of it in the long term,
or mixing up your burn rotation. I mean, all those kinds of things, just kind of figuring all that out. And it's not to say that having a dense grass plant community in some cases is a bad thing. I've got some places where landowners are trying to manage, have a field here and there, let's say, that is a dense grass and it's a highly productive field and they burn it every 2 years, they want that hot, intense fire. You wouldn't want all your fields to look like that, but having one or two dense grass fields, and their objective too is deer cover. So that's not to say that dense grass fields are just there's no place for them ever.
Right.
But when
they're
today's
still
episode,
probably better than the pasture grasses for most of the things that we were talking about. So
yeah, that's right. So now we're talking about deer. Well, I'm sorry. Right now we're talking about turkey and quail brood rearing, and so clearly we want to. Now the other thing I did want to mention, because we were just talking about killing woody vegetation. Woody vegetation is not altogether bad for brood rearing and nesting. If you look at most of the literature, especially for bobwhites and especially for turkeys, some woody vegetation is okay. I mean, we don't, having this annual plant community, weedy plant community, certainly that's what we want for brood rearing cover, but having a few shrubs in there is not bad. And for nesting cover, it's certainly a good thing. Again, we're providing more vertical structure so that it can aid in predator avoidance and also having some thermal cover.
Yeah, so having some little patches of plums or blackberry or something like that scattered around isn't a bad thing.
Yeah, not bad at all.
So there's, I guess before we wrap this up, there's something that just struck me. I haven't heard you say at all, and I always get asked about it, and I'm sure you do too. You haven't talked about planting anything to restore these old fields. So why have you not brought up planting native grass or forbs or whatever?
Sure, just mainly because it's rarely necessary. We do bring plant material into a site on occasion when it is the landowner's goal to have a certain plant community. Sometimes we work with landowners that want to have an aesthetic. Maybe they want to have a certain type of wildflower, or they want it to be, you know what I mean? And that's their, man. They pay the taxes, that's their right. And so we certainly will do that. We've gotten to be pretty good at planting native plant material, to be quite honest with you. But it's rarely necessary, almost never necessary for quality brood rearing and nesting cover.
Okay.
Almost
so let's make that really clear. So if you have a field that you want the plants to be a certain community, you would plant it in some cases to make sure that happened. But in terms of making sure that it was good for turkeys to bring their poults in, you're telling me that that's almost never needed.
Almost never. And when I say almost never, I mean like if I've got a cotton field, we've literally walked away from cotton fields and never had to plant anything, because even the mare's tail and stuff that comes in there the first year is going to be brood rearing cover. And by the second and third and fourth year, you're starting to get some of those agronomic weeds out of there just through either treating them or for regular old attrition, man. Even if you just fallow fields, by the third or fourth year, some of those aggressive weeds kind of play out. And through the course of plant succession and the seed bank response, almost always we will get some type of usable plant material on the site without having to bring in outside plant material.
So it sounds like you're saying almost just because you don't want to say never.
That you're correct. Well, no, I've legitimately had times where you never did. We didn't, and it really is not the cotton field example, Marcus. What happens is those pasture grass situations where we've come in and treated, and then we get woody vegetation. I've got it's just a soil type thing, really. To be honest with you, we get these really productive soil types, and we have to go in and just spray and spray and spray. Eventually, you'll run out. You'll run out of stuff.
Yeah, you run out of stuff to colonize, and that is desirable because you keep trying to get rid of all the stuff that's undesirable that keeps trying to get in there.
Yeah, so, pretty much. And then again, I have no problem if somebody has an aesthetic issue. They like the way the native grass fields look that are planted and the wildflowers and stuff. They want to do that by the house, man. I'd rather do that because I don't want you to be unhappy. When you ride by it and get mad at the way it looks. I don't like that weedy mess. Well, fine, let's plant it right there by the house. Let's make it look good.
Right. Yeah, we want some high quality brooding cover around. That's what our goal is. So you need to be happy with it. So you want to keep that around.
Well, like I said, if it's 5 acres by the barn, man, let's do it. Let's plant it up, make it look pretty, and look like a magazine cover. But everywhere else, we're gonna we're going to put good brood rearing cover for cheap. We don't need to, we don't have to spend that money. The other thing too I did mention was herbicides, and if you ever do have a woody problem that gets ahead of you, the herbicides we have now are really good. Triclopyr, Arsenal, or Mazapyr is the chemical name. Spot applications work really well in fields because you can get to them. You know what I mean? You can put the old gun on the back of the tractor and ride around and gun the different trees. The boomless nozzles now are really good. They used to not be as good with calibration, but now they're really good. So herbicides are also a great tool for getting the woody control and for treating those invasive plants.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think you've pretty well covered that topic. Is there anything else that you think people that are really interested in producing high quality brooding or nesting cover in their fields should know?
No, man, I think that's it. I think you've just got to be active. It's like, I guess the two key things are, it's an active management. So you got to always be on top of it. You've got to be scouting that field and making sure you don't have invasive stuff coming in there, coating grass and all those types of things. Again, an active management, and be smart about it. Put it in those lesser soil types so you're not always fighting vegetation growth. And then, man, just have fun with it.
Yeah, exactly. All right, John. Well, I really appreciate it. I knew this would be a good conversation, and I always learned something from you. So I really appreciate you coming on here and telling everybody about this.
Oh, yeah. Appreciate it, man.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate you. We'll talk to you next time. Our university is part of the Natural Resource University Podcast Network, funded by the Renewable Resources Extension Act. If you like what you heard today in this episode, please follow us on all the social media platforms at UF Deer Lab.